All right, coming off of the question about why novels are so popular, why they still command so much of our attention, we also kind of have to think a little bit about TV as well. Because I don't know if you guys have noticed or not, but in the last, 5 or 10 years, television has come into its own. And a lot of people are saying that we are experiencing a second golden age of television. And part of the reason for this is that Hollywood has a lot of formulas that it follows in order to make money. Movies have to do particular things in order to bring in the maximum amount of audience. And we've kind of started to catch on to the fact that all these films are pretty much exactly the same. Think about this isn't an insult, the man's actually really good at this, but think of any Michael Bay movie. Part of Michael Bay's ability as a filmmaker is to make a film that the maximum amount of people will enjoy. Now, if you're the type of person that likes a good movie and likes a movie that does something original, you're not going to enjoy a lot of Michael Bay's films. And that's just the thing. He doesn't care. He's good at what he does because people like those tickets because they like the experience that Michael Bay brings. But for a lot of people, in case you guys don't know, Michael Bay is the guy who directed Transformers, Armageddon, I think The Island. Gosh, it seems like he was in Pearl Harbor. He did Pearl Harbor, but I don't think he did. I'll have to look that up later. These big blockbuster, boom, boom, bam special effect movies, people really flock to these things. But a lot of people have, like I said, begun to catch on to the fact that there's a formula for this, and you can kind of start to predict what these films are going to do and how they're going to do it, to the point that we've seen all this stuff before. It starts to get kind of boring. Well, television comes along, and gives us a lot more options. We can drag out a story much longer than the typical film can. We can experiment and change things up and see how the audience reacts to it and reacts to the audience. One of the big first examples of these new Golden Age TV shows would have been, I would probably say, Mad Men. Mad Men was just absolutely gigantic. That was on AMC. And one of the things about Mad Men is that it's very subtle, it's very slow. It really, really concentrates on character development. This one, from Mad Men, you can also look at Breaking Bad, did the same thing. These shows also weren't that scared to kill off characters that people loved in order to advance the story and get people even more dialed in. The show and the story that really, really pushed the envelope on this was Game of Thrones. Now, I'm sure a lot of you out there in internet land have seen Game of Thrones. Probably not as many of you have read the book. If you haven't read the book, it's really freaking good. I mean, it's one of those books that I could just kind of sit down and curl up with and just enjoy it for the story aspect of it. But as a story, one of the things that our author, George R.R. Martin, has done with this series is the fact that when you read it, no one's safe. Literally anybody can die at any moment, and you have no idea who's next. Now, I have to be really careful because, I don't want anybody to be upset because I'm about to spoil major plot points. But in our first volume, you get the real sense that Ned Stark is going to be our main character. He's going to be the person that everything revolves around. We get emotionally attached to Ned Stark. And, we're going through the story with him and we care about him. Usually that's what you do with your main character, right? Now, I want to talk about the American aspect of this book, but first let me do this. This is the signal of the big tectonic shift in the way that stories are told and the way that shows are produced that connects directly to the novel. Martin wanted his series, he wanted it to be a fantasy series, meaning, it's got a little bit of dragons and kings and wizards and stuff like that. You don't see as much of the wizardry, although it kind of comes in later with the sorceress Melisandre. But he wanted it to be realistic. He wanted to write The Lord of the Rings for adults. Now, that's part of the reason why one of the first things he does is he kills off the main character, right? He kills off one of the central characters to the whole story, and we are just left completely confused and lost in the story. Because after he dies, now we have to acclimate ourselves to his children, the people who are left behind, to his wife, to his sons, and to his daughters. And they are all completely separated from each other for the most part. And they all go off in separate directions and have their own stories. It's an amazing effect because for this story, for Game of Thrones to be realistic, that kind of has to happen. For it to be set in a kind of medieval world, guess what? In the Middle Ages, no one was safe. No one was safe. And he really brings that to life with the fact that he is just so quick to kill off his characters. Now, the American aspect of this book, if I were to sit back and ask you, what is it that makes Game of Thrones an exemplary piece of American fiction? You kind of have a little bit of a problem here, because usually American fiction, this is part of the reason why I like Game of Thrones so much, usually American fiction is very, it participates in something that we call navel gazing. It knows it's American, and it kind of celebrates its Americanness, which, I'm not going to lie, like, I get it when we were a young country and we're going through all these changes, but now it just kind of comes off as, like, pompous. Like, we are going to talk about our Americanness again. Stephen King, unfortunately, does this crap a lot, too. Almost every single one of his stories is set in Maine, right? It's a small town concept. It's small town people. It's got a lot of those almost cliched American tropes. Now, Game of Thrones doesn't really give us that because we're not set in America. We're now in a completely divorced fantasy world from where, we normally are more in other novels. So coming to the Americanness of Game of Thrones is a little bit more of a challenge. I'll offer up a theory, because I haven't really seen a paper written about this yet on like Galileo, although I'm sure it's coming. What is American about Game of Thrones? Probably the politics. Game of Thrones is one of those books that absolutely embraces the political intrigue, and it does it in a really good way. You have the houses, right? The different families vie for power. And adding to that kind of anxiety of the fact that at any moment, anyone in the story can be killed by any other family, you're constantly wondering, who is going to betray who? Who is going to do something awful next? Who is going to actually find their conscience? There are examples in all of the houses, whether it be the Starks in the north, whether it be the Lannisters, Castellary Rock, whether it's the Martells, or I can't believe I'm blanking on all these right now. All these houses have their examples of kind of like their villains and their heroes. And you also have people who kind of fall in the middle. What is Tyrion Lannister? Tyrion, the dwarf, I think he's referred to in the text, he runs in and out of good and evil very quickly and very comfortably. Because in the very beginning, he is very sympathetic to the Starks. He befriends Jon Snow, right? Now, as his story goes on, he's basically caught in the whirlwind of the politics of his family, constantly trying to balance his kind of moral side with the relentless evil of his family, with Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, and Cersei, right? They are pretty terrible, but Cersei gives us the quote, and it's the title of the book. What she says is, in the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. There is no in between. And so in this case, we can kind of look at, the really ambitious ones, the people who are doing all of the truly awful stuff. Are they evil, or is this just how you survive in this world? That's like one of the big questions. Back to the American to the American nature of Game of Thrones. Politics is vicious. Vicious, and sometimes violent, and sometimes just absolutely destructive. Now, I would argue that at least in the modern era, politics in America has become quite poisonous as well. Now, I don't necessarily have to talk to you too much about the most recent election. I don't have to demonize either of them because pretty much everybody in this country has already demonized one or the other, right? The people who are elected, we've got your political parties, and guess what? You have your political families. You have the Clintons, you have the Bushes, you have there was the Kennedys. In this case, the Kennedys are kind of like the Targaryens, right? They've disappeared. There's nowhere to be seen anymore, at least not in politics. And then you've got now a new family who has entered the picture in the Trumps. It's a very interesting new era we've broken into. But, I mean, all you got to do is look at the news, and you can see the conniving, and you can see the aggression that these people show towards each other. The only difference is that in Game of Thrones, there's swords, right? And the weapons in the American context aren't swords. They're scandals, right? There's always the threat of a new scandal breaking, and the scandal is the thing that will cut your throat. Ned Stark, his head is put on a pike at the end of Game, and not even at the end, like towards the end of Game of Thrones, the first book. But for a lot of our politicians, the head on the pike is the stuff you do in private becoming public, and at that point, you may as well be politically dead. You're politically inert. The funny thing was, for Trump committed a lot, and to be fair, Hillary did too, but she didn't do it as fabulously. Trump committed a lot of sins that before would have shut a candidate out. A whole bunch of them, very publicly. The thing they kept saying during the election cycle was he kept setting himself on fire. Except, guess what? It didn't hurt him. He won. He won, despite the fact that he had attacks coming from every single direction. It was like the return of an all-powerful Targaryen ruler. And that's not a moral judgment on Trump at all. It's just the power with which he was able to come into the system and rise above it, right? The swords don't hurt him anymore. The arrows bounce off of him. So now the political playbook in America is having to be rewritten, which, if Daenerys Targaryen ever returns to, why am I having so much trouble? Westeros. If she ever returns to Westeros, her dragons will change everything. Part 2 coming soon.